Hi, class. Nice to see everybody. Welcome to Ethics. I am going to be talking about utilitarianism and then some problems with utilitarianism, as well as ending on some of the categorical imperatives for today. Hopefully, all of you are finding great, um, uh, illustrative education from some of the reading of this book. It's a very short book, but like I said, it's very clear, and I really appreciate Rachel's contribution. So let's go ahead and talk about utilitarianism. So I think a good way to talk about the principle of utility, asks the question or states that morality is really about making the world as happy as possible. That's a principle of utility. Right there, that our ethical drive is to make the world a happy place. And if life is not worth living, if life is unhappy for particular people, then we shouldn't continue to live that life. So that's really what utility, how you could sum up utility right there. It's just the principle requires us in all circumstances to produce the most happiness that we possibly can. If you get to the point where you can no longer produce a lot of happiness, that's not actually an ethical view that we should hold on to. And it makes a lot of sense why utilitarians would be concerned about this, because utilitarians or consequentialists were really concerned with Immanuel Kant, because Immanuel Kant was strictly about duty, and utilitarians were all about duty, but they didn't feel like if the duty actually led to good results or pleasurable results, then we need to kind of question whether or not the duty is worth living by. So that's really where the consequentialist theory comes in. In other words, if it's not working, or if a particular ethical code is not helping or working, making a society a better place or a more pleasurable place to live in, should we be abiding by these particular ethical codes? So that's really the principle of utility. Utility is just asking those questions. And it's in some ways utilitarianism is somewhat freeing. I guess that's a huge buzzword. I don't want to use freedom too much here. Freedom often involves a negative and a positive attribute. It's a freeing word in the sense that it tries to get back to the basics, a basic question on putting things under a more positive microscope. If it brings up more of a positive gain, then we should look at it as something that should be ethical for our civilization. If it brings it to a more negative gain or lack of gain, then we should kind of get rid of it. We'll look at some examples of that here in a minute. So Rachel's gives us a few examples where euthanasia would often take a very different approach than maybe a duty formed or divine, say for example, divine theory or natural law. It would take a different stance on issues like euthanasia, which is basically assisted suicide. It would take a different stance on things like animal rights, and it would also take a very different stance on drugs. And we'll look at how the principle of utility would see things a little bit differently than, say, for example, natural law or social contract theory or ethical egoism. So let's look at those few examples, and Rachel does a good job at offering us the first example of euthanasia. So utilitarianism is no longer really involved with a God being in the picture per se. It's looking at it as a society on whether or not things will bring up the greatest pleasure, greatest amount of good, or the greatest amount of harm to a particular person. So when you look at the question of euthanasia is often given to people who are at the end of their lives. They no longer want to live their lives, and they feel like their life is no longer worth living. So Sigmund Freud, for example, at the end of his life, because he had smoked for years and years and years, got to the point where he no longer had a jaw, and his jaw was actually coming off of his coming off of his head. The jawbone was actually tearing apart, and to the point where his flesh was rotting. And he had to wear an actual mosquito net over his face, to the point where he couldn't even talk anymore. And then he finally asked. He was 83. He was 83 years old, and he asked his friend, his doctor, to just let him drink some poison and just be end with it, because he no longer felt like life was really worth living. He felt like he lived a full life, lived a very full life, fruitful life, didn't want to go on for another 5 to 6 years having this cancer and having his jaw slowly deprecate and live this miserable, awful life in the last few years of his very old age. So he asked his friend, and his friend did it. And his friend said, I will assist you. And Sigmund Freud drank some, I believe it was some poison on his deathbed, and he died. So if you looked at that from a person that believed in divine law or natural theology, people in the church would have really condemned what his friend did. They would have said, you just murdered Sigmund Freud. A utilitarian would look at it very differently. They would actually see it as assisting Sigmund Freud in an ethical decision, or they would say that that person assisted Sigmund Freud to die well, and they actually made an ethical choice, a positive ethical choice, because, as I said before, the principle of utility is concerned with to produce the most kind of happiness as possible. So when the doctor assisted Freud, Freud then got to the point where he could no longer be the most happy in his life, and what was most happy for him is that he died well, and that was what was considered most happy for him. So therefore, his friend was not doing something that was considered unethical for utilitarian. He was doing something that was very ethical. So see how it already kind of sets the tone and sets things up quite differently than our other moral theories. The other example is the example of marijuana, So marijuana is, if you look at marijuana, a lot of people would say, prior to, I guess, about 5 years ago, this book's somewhat dated a little bit because a lot of the crimes that the book states, at least my edition, which is the 7th edition, that were given to people who were selling marijuana, I don't think they're the same crimes in most of the states that we, like especially not from Massachusetts. But anyway, when this book was written, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars was put in place by law enforcement to basically incriminate other people who are selling marijuana, who are using marijuana. Thousands of criminals are actually in prison. I think that's still true. Who basically because of either the selling or the production of weed. And ask the question, if you're looking at it from a utilitarian point of view, to produce the most amount of happiness, then you really don't have much of an argument to say that you should continue to incriminate people who use this substance. When you compare marijuana with alcohol, there's very little debate. Alcohol has caused a significant amount of harm in comparison to marijuana. You rarely hear of a man beating up his girlfriend or wife because he was high. If anything, he probably wouldn't. Alcohol, quite the contrary. You do get some car accidents with people smoking marijuana, but much, much, much fewer than people who are drunk. So when you really kind of compare and contrast alcoholism versus people who smoke weed, it's just not much of a difference. And so a person with a utilitarian mindset, or who apply utilitarian principles in their ethical choices, would say, what's the harm? In fact, if you compare and contrast the marijuana versus alcohol, for example, it seems to bring a lot more good for society. Therefore, we should legalize that drug. That's another example of that. And then a third example would actually be animals. So this is where utilitarianism has probably had the biggest influence in our society. Peter Singer is a very well-known utilitarian ethicist, and he has fought avidly most of his life for the rights of animals. And his main argument is that his main argument is that whether or not animals can feel pain, and if animals can feel pain, that's his main concern, we shouldn't be continuing to kill them in very harmful ways. So that's what Peter Singer's main argument is. He's not necessarily concerned with whether or not animals are equal or not equal to human beings. That's not a concern for him. What he's really concerned about is whether or not animals actually feel pain. And if they feel pain, then we have no right to actually destroy in a very harmful way their lives. So utilitarians have actually done a significant amount of work in animal rights. They have posited the question for a lot of people on whether or not we have the right to go off and continue to take a significant amount of pleasure slaughtering animals by by doing some significant harm to their little bodies. And it gives it gives plenty of examples of people eating, like, say, for example, veal, which, that it brings up a lot of ethical decisions, a lot of a big ethical discussion, because veal is often done in very dire and drastic measures, not drastic, but drastic measures, where the little baby calf is just basically entrapped, and the baby calf cannot move, and the baby calf has gotten to the point where he can't even basically give himself iron. He has to lick his own urine, stuff like that. He can't even move his head. So the utilitarian would look at that and say that's very unethical, because if the baby calf or if these cows can actually feel this kind of pain, we shouldn't do such harmful things to them, because we should try to refrain from causing a significant amount of pain to any living creature. So that's kind of the utilitarian and kind of creative way of looking at the world. So that's just a basic idea of what utilitarianism is. Now there's a debate over utilitarianism, and the debate kind of goes whether or not pleasure is all that really matters. So I think Rachel's does a very good job at saying how you have some problems when you look at just when you equate, happiness with what is good for society. When you try to equate those things, you can run into some problems with utilitarianism. Are consequences, in other words, all that matters? A philosopher, H.J. McCloskey, asks us to consider the following case: if consequences are all that matters. And on page 112, suppose a utilitarian were visiting an area in which there was racial strife, and that during his visit, a Negro rapes a white woman, just reading his words, and that race riots occur as the result of the crime. Suppose, too, that our utilitarian is in the area of the crime when it is committed, so the utilitarian comes in and sees this awful crime committed, such that his testimony would bring about the conviction of whomever he accuses. If he knows that a quick arrest will stop the riots and lynchings, surely, as a utilitarian, he must conclude that he has a duty to bear false witness in order to bring about the punishment of an innocent person. In other words, if you're a utilitarian, according to McCloskey, and you go in and you see all these riots, and you see a bunch of lynchings, and you see a lot of crime, a significant increase of crime, mainly from a black man murdering an innocent black man, supposedly murdering a white woman, which he didn't do. According to the utilitarian, according to McCloskey, hope you're following me, he would say, well, even though he's not guilty, he should still be punished, because it would stop all the riots. In other words, McCloskey is really critical of the utilitarian approach, because he thinks that if you're a utilitarian, you would actually think it's okay for an innocent party to be punished for the majority, because you would see a lot less crime. So I didn't quite explain this. Utilitarianism likes to put things under a calculus principle. So this is like Jeremy Bentham. What he liked to say is, if in order to really make an ethical decision, and if utilitarian principle is to try to find the most pleasurable event, most pleasurable activity, what you often would try to do is you would put things under a kind of calculus. And I'm sure most of you have probably done this before. You put like a little positive sign on one side and you put a negative sign on the other, and then you just kind of cross them apart. Say, for example, if you want to go to Endicott College, all right, positives, likelihood of getting a better job increases significantly. They've got one of the best internships in the nation. I don't know if you knew that. Wall Street Journal just said Endicott has is the number 2 college in the world, or at least in the nation, for getting an internship, which is fantastic and very overlooked characteristic of a college, of a university, because at the end of the day, you're not actually interning with the job. The likelihood of getting a job is very, very low. So that's pretty awesome what Endicott does. So if I go to Endicott, the likelihood of me actually getting a job significantly rises. But the negatives are I have some serious student loans. I'm away from family. So what am I doing? I'm putting things under a kind of utilitarian calculus. And Jeremy Bentham would say most of us are like that. So going back to the whole justice thing on accusing an innocent party, what McCloskey is arguing against is that consequences at times just do not matter. Because for some, if you're really a utilitarian, you would say, if I just put things under a calculus, I should probably let this innocent man become guilty, because what it would do, it would stop the riots, it would stop more deaths, it would stop more lynchings. Therefore, you know what? Let him be guilty, even though he's innocent. So according to McCloskey, he really has a problem with utilitarianism because it doesn't seem to respect justice in all circumstances. Another thing about utilitarianism is that, in chapter 8, just to let you know, sometimes it often doesn't actually respect rights. And so rights of other people. And so the book gives an example of a case where a woman, this is a true story, a woman who was brought in by the police department, and they asked her to take all of her clothes off, and they actually took pictures of her in the nude. And this police department then basically after that made various photographs to and spread out those her very private photos of her to other officers for their own pleasure. And a utilitarian would often say, well, it's not really hurting somebody. They're getting more pleasure by looking at these photographs. Therefore, what's the harm? In other words, if you're a peeping Tom and nobody's catching you, who's to say what the peeping Tom is doing that's harmful? He's getting pleasure out of it. Nobody knows what he's doing is wrong. Therefore, is he really doing something that's wrong? That's a typical utilitarian kind of. I would kind of say it's a straw man, but at the same time, that's usually the critics of utilitarianism. That's what they're really concerned about. It seems like they let people that don't necessarily seem to be bothering anybody, that are just like looking at nude pictures of a woman who happened to be in the police officer in the police station, or if you're a peeping Tom, if you're not quote harming anyone. If it's not really harming anyone in the public, what's really the big deal about it? And that's a big critique when it comes to utilitarianism as well. Pornography, for example, pornography is often justified from a very utilitarian mindset. Hey, it's women who are and men who are getting paid to do these acts. It's causing pleasure for all these people. Therefore, what's the big deal about it? Unfortunately, when you really look at the pornography industry, there's a significant amount of abuse. A lot of these women are actually not paid. A lot of these women are actually sex slaves. In fact, most people in the pornography industry have, I can't remember the percentage, but it's a significant high number of those women who are doing the pornography, who are doing pornography, likely were kidnapped and actually forced to be in this kind of business. So it's pretty. So a utilitarian, though, some utilitarians would say, well, it's a small percentage of those people that are doing that. Look at all the quote pleasure it's causing all these teenage men or older men or whatever, and women. So that for a lot of people you could see why a lot of ethicists would have some problems with utilitarians' justification of not only pornography but also the peeping Toms and the example it gives of the poor woman that was falsely incriminated in a police station and then taking pictures of. And so it doesn't seem like it really respects people's rights. What do you do with the pornography incident? What do you do with the woman that was whose pictures are being all over? She's being totally violated without her consent, or peeping Tom, even though he's getting pleasure off that. And what do you do with a poor woman she didn't sign anything and agree for him to be looking at her? So what about their rights? So that's the problem. There's some problems with utilitarianism that doesn't quite answer. And the other problem with utilitarianism is that it seems to be Blackboard looking. And what I mean by that, it seems to only be concerned about the consequences of the actions, and it doesn't necessarily look at the principle. And so an example of that would be, if I promise you that I'm going to come over, I'm a fellow student, and I make a promise that on Saturday night, on December 7th or whatever, I'm going to come over and I'm going to help you study for the exam, on the final exam. And I promise to be there. I mean, actually make a promise I'll definitely be there. Well, I kind of forget that at the end of the day, I kind of forget that there was a Patriots game on that day, and unfortunately, I have to back out, and I have to back out of my promise because lo and behold, the Patriots are playing, and I call you up and I say, "Hey man, I'm really sorry, can't do it," and it kind of puts you in a rug, not rug, but in a rug, in a rug because you're kind of unfortunately you're in a very unfortunate predicament because you needed my help, and my promise is meaningless. And why do I back out? Because as a utilitarian, I want to do what's most pleasurable for me, and for what's most pleasurable for me at that moment is watching the Patriots game over than studying. So you can see some of the problems with utilitarianism that some people actually give up. However, Rachel's doesn't buy any of those arguments. The first argument is kind of easy to refute. The first argument when it comes to justice. So when he gives the example of the person that's innocent, the black man that's innocent, that utilitarian would just say, well, you should just let that person go, and you should just let him be guilty. The reason why a lot of utilitarians wouldn't buy into that is because, going what I was saying about 15 minutes ago about animal rights. Think about animal rights, for example. What I mean by that is utilitarians are concerned about everybody. So they're always asking the question: can this person, or can this thing, even if it's a little animal or to a human being, can this person that I'm dealing with actually feel pleasure or feel pain? And if it can feel pain, it shouldn't. We shouldn't allow it just to go off and become guilty and even though this person is actually innocent, or in the case of an animal, an animal should just willingly die out of this horrific death so that you can just eat the good meat. A utilitarian would not buy into that, nor would it buy into asking innocent people to go off and be guilty. So a lot of utilitarians would kind of refute the first claim. However, it's not quite as easy on that, and I think Rachel does a good job, because even though most utilitarians would be for animal rights, they're animal right advocates, it still doesn't stop the application of utilitarian principles, which has been to put things under a calculus. And at the end of the day, it does seem, when you apply utilitarian ethics, that a significant amount of people, because they're the minimal group of people, they end up actually getting backhanded. A good example of that in a significant way is the atom bomb. So Harry Truman looked at the dropping the atomic bomb in a very, very utilitarian type of. He used basically utilitarian ethics. He didn't believe in moral codes, for example. He actually just kind of put things under a principle of positive and negative behavior, or positive and negative results. And that's what the next chapter actually kind of talks about a little bit. And Harry Truman is basically his justification for the atom bomb was, I'm going to drop the atom bomb on thousands of innocent lives because that's the negative. The positive, hundreds of thousands of lives will be saved in the end. So that brings up some real problems. So again, as much as people want to refute the counterexample or the counter argument to utilitarians that yes, you're all concerned about animal rights advocates, and yes, you do seem to be for the rights of other people. Nevertheless, people who apply utilitarian principles often do get in trouble, much like Harry Truman, in the sense of answering serious ethical questions on whether or not that was a legitimate choice or not. But again, Rachel's, I think, offers some good feedback and good guides on how we should look at utilitarianism. That at the end of the day, the way we can kind of use it in a very practical way is not to look at individual rules, but actually, not to look at it as individual acts, but to look at utilitarianism as rule utilitarianism. So he talks about that in 119, that probably a better way to look at utilitarianism is to look at what rule is actually being applied that causes the most amount of pleasure for people. So always ask the question, what is the main rule or the meta narrative of utilitarian of that principle, not necessarily the act. So there's a big difference. So according to Rachel's, when you ask the rule, you stay out of a lot of trouble. If the rule is we should have justice in our society because a more just society is better for other people, then under that example, that rule utilitarian principle, you really can never ask an innocent party to then become guilty. But if you're concerned about act utilitarian, then this particular act, in this case, well, maybe this innocent person should go and become guilty. You see the difference? So, in other words, what Rachel, in order to solve that, he likes to differentiate between rule and act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism has a lot of problems. Rule utilitarianism can be much more beneficial. That we should have certain maxims for our society that would benefit the overarching pleasure for a variety of people. So going back on the whole euthanasia, Sigmund Freud kind of debate, the rule may be that if we get to the point of our lives where we don't actually feel the need to go on because our lives are just such a burden, do we have a right to end it? Okay, that's the question. I'm not going to get into that right now because I think it's a very complex question. But that would be the general rule. And if you actually believe that's the case, then what Sigmund Freud did was fine. It was ethical. Very complex, but at the same time, it's good that Rachel's kind of disciplines this philosophy so that we can understand it a little bit better. And then the other thing too about backwards thinking, or that common sense that utilitarians. Sorry, I'm going to go back in just a second. Another problem with utilitarians is that it seems too burdensome. Forgot to mention that. So a lot of people think that utilitarians are very kind of demanding in a lot of ways. And there's a good point to that. I mean, utilitarians, if they want to see the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people, would often make you often feel very guilty if you didn't do something like like benefit more people, like give yourself up so that you can actually benefit more people. So an example of that would be, say if you and your partner want to go to Vegas and you want to spend, I don't know, $3,000 on a Vegas vacation for a hotel, for a few nights, for some casino, go to the casino, and then to have some fun and go see a show. Utilitarian would then say, a typical utilitarian would then kind of come in and say, well, that is $3,000, and your $3,000 would probably be better used feeding all of these hungry people over here in Africa. In fact, you could probably feed 5 or 6 villages with that $3,000. Therefore, I don't think you should go to Vegas because look at all the greater number of good that you would cause if you actually did that over your Vegas trip. And so a lot of people have problems with utilitarianism because they think it's too demanding. But the problem with that is that that's a fallacy. Okay, so it's too demanding. You're still kind of evading the question whether or not utilitarianism is right or wrong. If it's too demanding, it's too demanding. That doesn't mean that's right or wrong. So a critic would say, a true utilitarian, and this is what Rachel says, doesn't actually buy into that. Just because it's too demanding doesn't mean that it's wrong. It could be that it's actually right. It's just making you feel guilty because you know what you're doing is wrong. So anyway, you guys can read some more of those thoughts on there, and it's very interesting kind of philosophy. I like some of the questions that it asks, for our ethical discussion, and I like how this book just continues to make things a little bit more complex for us. And you can see that when we talk about ethics, at first we went from like very elementary subjectivism versus objectivism to divine law to social contract to whether or not people are just egotistical to now how do we make a little bit more of an informed decision when we're coming in contact with very difficult questions. And finally, I want to talk about Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, his main categorical imperative So the categorical imperative is probably one of the most powerful statements of all in all of ethics. And a categorical imperative states this that we are to act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So that's a brilliant statement. I think Kant will always be infamous and well and he's well deserved for being for being so infamous because I think that is such a quite possibly it's one of the most brilliant sentences in all of ethics in my opinion. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So whatever decision you come in contact with, you need to ask the question whether or not you think it should also be universal as well. So a good example of that would be, say, I don't know, I got some taxes, and I get an IRS letter, and it says that Peter Anderson, you owe $500 in taxes, and so then I kind of ask myself, well, should I actually pay these taxes, or should I let them go, or should I try to, I don't know, cheat my way out of it and tell my accountant that, you know, the computer I bought last year was really this year, and get some deduction. So to do something like that, or just not pay for the taxes. And so that's the question, whether or not I should pay my $500 bill, or I should just go ahead and, whether I should or shouldn't. And so Kant would say, okay, well, you brought up an ethical decision. Now let's ask, now that you have the maxim, now you need to ask yourself the question whether or not you could will that universally, your maxim can be universally applied. So that's the question. That's where the difficulty hits the road. Because if I were to say, for example, cheat on my taxes, can I therefore will that should be universal in the sense that everybody has a right to cheat on their taxes? Well, no, immediate no. If we actually had that, we would have absolute chaos. Okay, we would. Another good example of that would be, say for example, and this is where I think categorical imperative is really important because, say for example, if you want to do something like, I don't know, if you want to cheat on somebody, all right, so I meet somebody very, very attractive. Should I cheat on my partner because this person seems very attractive and I want to find pleasure in this particular situation and it seems pleasurable to me and my partner would never know about it? That's the utilitarian kind of mindset. Well, what Kant would say is, okay, you think that just because you're away for the weekend, you have the right to go off and cheat on your partner. Now, do you think that you can then therefore say that everybody has the right to cheat on their partner universally? Well, no. I wouldn't be able to, you would never see people actually be able to trust anybody. You would see an amazing amount of divorces. You would see an amazing amount of breakups. You would see an amazing amount of broken families. So that's the problem with Kant. That's why it's such a brilliant statement, because the minute you can say it can't be a universal law, then it's therefore unethical. Okay? And how you know that you're being ethical is when you can state it's a universal law. So if I'm going out on a vacation and I meet an attractive person, and should I cheat or should I not cheat? Well, I shouldn't cheat. And can I state that everybody probably shouldn't cheat on their partner? Well, yeah. Okay, then it's ethical not to do that. See how it works both ways. So Kant's statement is just quite brilliant. I really do think it's probably the most. I used to have my students actually memorize it as for extra credit on their midterm. So that's really what Kant tells us to do. I do think that Kant gets sometimes misunderstood because Kant doesn't believe in any form of lying. So Kant would also apply the categorical imperative on lying. I think actually Kant spent way too much ink on trying to prove a point. Kant was so brilliant, but I think sometimes he would just kind of diverge certain. He would get frustrated at little minute details. Okay, and just to tell you a little bit about Kant, Kant was he never actually left his hometown, Prussia, I believe, and the local clocksmen and carpenters and priests of his town would they didn't have clocks back when he was alive. They had big clocks, but they didn't have like individual watches or anything, and they could always tell the time because Immanuel Kant was so OCD about making sure that he was on, that his schedule was, he took his little walk daily. He took his little walk in the morning, went to go eat his lunch every single day at the same exact place, and people would actually be able to tell time based on the way Immanuel Kant organized his day. So he was very, 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 very kind of particular, and sometimes that kind of showed in his philosophy a little bit as well. So Kant didn't believe that you ever had you can never ever get away from lying. So Kant would say that, is there ever a time where you could, putting a lie under a categorical imperative, for example, would never actually pass? This is where sometimes I think the one thing that categorical imperative has somewhat of has some problems, even though I still think it's a brilliant statement. Because when you look at lying, for example, lying doesn't seem to pass the categorical imperative, because when you say, can I will that it universally shall apply, I can't necessarily make that case. However, there are times where I think lying is very justified. Say, for example, during the World War II, there were a lot of people that actually hid Jews from the Nazis and lied to the Nazis and said, when the Nazis knocked on their door and said, hey, are you carrying any Jews? And the people lied to them and said, no, I'm not. I did see some Jews come through here, and they actually went that way. They led the Nazis away. There are plenty of very, very heroic people in World War II that actually did that, basically lied to the Nazis. But Kant he never allowed. Now of course, I got to give Kant some grace here. Kant didn't know who the Nazis were. There were no world wars during that time. He lived in a pretty peaceful regime. So I don't think Kant really probably had a lot of those questions on mind. And Kant was so brilliant, I'm sure he probably would have figured something out. But I still think the categorical imperative works, because you could say as a maxim that you should not lie unless it saves the life of another person. Now, Kant did have some arguments with that, because he was thinking of that. He did say that, he gave an example of a person who objected to Kant's categorical imperative by saying, what if you have a murderer who is seeking out to kill somebody, and the murderer knocks on your door and you know exactly where that person is? Do you have a right to lie to that person who wants to murder your neighbor? And Kant would say no. And the reason why is because, one, it doesn't pass the categorical imperative test. Remember, Kant was very, very regimented in his schedule. But number two, Kant would also say no, because if you told him a lie and the neighbor then decided to leave the house and the murderer then met him on the path, you would be responsible for the murder, which I don't buy into at all. Come on, Mr. Kant. I don't. Because if you were to tell him a lie, if you were to tell him the truth and he happened to be there, then what's to say that you're not then responsible? Okay, so if the Nazis came and they knocked on the door and you didn't lie and you said, oh yeah, I've got 5 Jews upstairs, would you not be held responsible for the murder of those Jews? There's a good debate on that. So I think Kant kind of misses it a little bit, but I do think that you can still get away with the maxim of saying, I will not lie under any circumstances unless it is for the protection and unless I'm under a tyrannical regime, and it's to save the life of an innocent party. I think you can get away with that. All right. And do I universally want that to be applied everywhere? I can confidently say yes. If anybody is under a tyrannical regime like North Korea or whatever, and they come knocking on the door and they're looking for an innocent party and they want to kill that person, I think universally that person has a right to say, don't know where they are. Okay. So that's really kind of Kant's insight and into these matters. And next week we'll be talking about Kant in respect of persons, and we'll be looking at that. But until then, look forward to seeing all of you soon. Good job keeping up with these assignments. You guys are brave. You really are doing ethics. And very busy. And many of you are probably taking full-time classes. Some of you are graduating. So, keep it up. Keep up the good work, and talk to you soon.